Hello, and welcome to Just Keep Writing.
A podcast for writers.
By writers.
To keep you writing.
I'm Wil.
I'm Shingai.
I'm Sameem.
And I'm Gabe.
And today we have Jenna Hanchey, who's back on the podcast because she's never leaving again.
Yay!
Say hello, Jenna.
Hi, everyone. I get to come back again.
Amazing. So, Jenna's first episode with us was episode 167, where we talked about executive dysfunction. And we had a lot of amazing feedback in our Discord community. Who just talked about their own executive dysfunction and also talked about, how much the episode really meant to them. So I would encourage everyone, if you are listening and you haven't joined our Discord, or if you're one of those shadow dwellers who just like to see what everyone's talking about, get involved in the conversation. So for this episode, I really wanted to highlight Jenna so our listeners can get to know her and her work. So Jenna, why don't you just give us again, because I know you kind of talked about it in episode 167. Why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself, and then we'll move into our first question.
Hi, everyone. I guess I'm introducing myself again, and I always don't know how to do this very well. So, hi, I'm Jenna. I think I told you all that I have published mostly flash fiction. It's not true that I write mostly flash fiction. It is true that magazines only seem to want to buy things I have written that are 1,500 words or under, though I have now sold one short story at 2,300 words. So breaking out, everyone. And then I also write poetry, speculative poetry. I'm the poetry editor at Orion's Belt magazine. I co-host the podcast Griots and Galaxies on African speculative fiction, which I am currently scheming on doing a second season with my co-hosts Yvette and Chanello, and we're working on that. I'm a narrator for Strange Horizons and Simultaneous Times, as well as officially on the catalog for the Escape Artist podcast. So if any of you out there want this voice to read your story on an Escape Artist venue, I'm available. They just haven't called on me yet. And then I'm also an academic who writes things like journal articles and essays. And then I also write book reviews for the LA Review of Books and Ancillary Review of Books. I don't know what else I should say. Hi, that's a little bit about me.
I think that is amazing. And you wear so many different hats and they all interconnect. So I think that was a great introduction. And I think with thinking of your introduction, this is just a question I like to ask all of our guests, is I want you to describe your career in 3 words, which can be completely unrelated, whatever comes to your mind first.
Okay. So I had some preparation for this question, having listened to the podcast and also been reminded by some friends that this was coming. And then the one word that initially popped into my head was multitudinous, because I feel like, wait, I'll do the 3 words first. Multitudinous. And then the other ones were flowing and feelings forward. And the first one is because I just do whatever I feel like. So I end up with all these different sorts of writing. There's just so many different little pieces of things. There's just a bunch of them. So like the latest one that's going to be coming out actually in the fall is a short script that I co-authored with a grad student that I work with who recently passed away. And it was the last thing that we had met about was submitting this script to a speculative fiction magazine. And that is going to be coming out in the fall. But yeah, I just have all these I just kind of do whatever medium feels right for the time or that I'm being pulled toward, which I guess is where the flowing comes in. Because my career as a writer I don't know if I like the word career. One, I guess, because I think about the things that I do not as necessarily oriented towards a like singular idea of a career, but I just kind of flow from one thing to the next, and it's really interesting to see how things emerge. Like the first piece of writing I ever published, I'm pretty sure, is a theoretical particle physics paper that I worked on in undergrad when I was a physics major. And so the first thing that I ever published was that as a team of like 6 co-authors. And that's on like supersymmetry theories of charge parity, like particle decay, and when it breaks charge parity norms. But it's all like supersymmetry theories, which I don't even know if that is still something that we think about as like the grounds for particle physics, because I haven't done it in 20 years. But that was the first thing that I published. And then I went from there into teaching in Peace Corps in Tanzania. And then I came back and was like, that was fucked up. And I need to figure out how it was fucked up and why and what I do about it. And so I stumbled into a master's program and then started writing academic work on neocolonialism and aid organizations, and then stumbled into doing work on African speculative fiction after I got tired of telling people like, hey, here's how to stop being a white savior, and thought, let's look at how Africans are imagining their own futures and what that does. And then I was like, writing speculative fiction actually seems really fucking important for everyone, and learning to stretch your imagination. And I'd been reading sci-fi and fantasy since I was a child. It was, my favorite things to read. So then I tried my hand at writing, and then I was like, wow, poetry seems cool too. Let's try that. Yeah, I don't know. I just kind of flow from one thing to another. So I think there's going to be more, and who knows what those will be. Oh yeah, creative nonfiction is something that I'm just recently trying my hand at writing. And in part that's been because I sometimes have to write things. I'm sure like a lot of artists experience this in various forms, but the push in your brain or in your feelings that this thing has to come out, and maybe a title appears to you. And I think of it as not just me, but kind of, I don't know, communion with ancestors or other sorts of things that are happening in the world, universal sorts of pulls, that sometimes there's just things that appear in my head that I have to sit down and write. And one of those was recently a creative nonfiction essay that I haven't really tried my hand at before. And so now there's some of those that I'm writing too. So flowing, things just kind of move. I didn't plan to be, I guess, yeah, I didn't even, I feel like I stumble into everything. I stumbled into writing academic work. I stumbled into writing science fiction and fantasy work. I'm now stumbling into creative nonfiction work. It just all kind of emerges from where I'm at in relation with people and with contexts. And then it's feelings forward, because a lot of it is also driven by depth of interconnections and relations and complex questions that I'm trying to work through and figure out how to engage better with others and in the world. Like I have an academic book that I think I talked about a little bit in the Just Keep Writing Discord chat, if you are there, because it was on sale a few weeks ago. But that book really came out of all the way back to when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and I was teaching physics in a high school in Tanzania in the Southern Highlands, where they wouldn't have had a physics teacher if I wasn't there, because the Tanzanian government at the time was not getting payments to village teachers on time. And so people were not teaching at those schools and taking jobs other places. And so I was doing work that was good in that way, that I felt was filling a need. But then also we were encouraged, pressured to do things like HIV/AIDS education and women's empowerment work as well. And the Peace Corps would give us, manuals for this that they had, which at first I was like, oh, yeah, cool. Absolutely. Everybody needs access to information on HIV/AIDS prevention and like health and how to deal with that. And then after a while, I was like, wait a second, I'm a 22-year-old with a physics degree. What in the world do I know about health at all in any context, let alone a cultural context that I have been in for, a handful of months? And so after I left, in the middle, and then particularly after I left, I was like, I need to figure out what that was about. So the book that I wrote comes from that experience, and then 10 years of still working with people in different areas, a different area in Tanzania, in an organization, and seeing how the Tanzanian aid workers were not listened to often by the Western donors, the people who had control over the money, in what actually needed to happen on the ground. And so the whole book came out of really wrestling with what is my own role in neocolonialism? How does that show up in the work that I've done? And how can we change that? As well as then getting other people on board with how can we change these circumstances so that the Tanzanians working in their own context, who know exactly what needs to happen but don't have access to the resources to make it happen, can access those resources and make the shit happen they need to make happen. So, but a lot of that too was me wrestling with okay, here's what I've taken part in. How can I write about that in a way that reflects over it, that can help both me to change the way that I am behaving in the world and relating with people, but then also give others a groundwork and a framework for doing that as well. So, and then I write a lot about grief and death and anxiety and toxic masculinity and emotionally abusive relationships, because all those feelings come out too. But it's magic. So it's not me. It is me, but it's also, there's magic.
Okay, so.
Sorry, I just talked about a bunch.
No, I love it. First, talk to us about the book that you mentioned. What was the title and where can people get it? That's
a good point, I guess. Hi, I have written a book that is called The Center Cannot Hold, Decolonial Possibility in the Collapse of a Tanzanian NGO. And it is available through Duke University Press. You can get it straight off of their website if you're in the US or Canada. And you can also buy it pretty much on any website, though let's avoid Amazon if we can.
Yes. All right. I want to go back a little bit before, because I want to touch upon your experience in Tanzania, because it seems like it was very much a focal point of re-envisioning the world. But I want to go a little bit before that. Talk to me about how you got into science fiction and fantasy as a kid. What kind of got you into that world? Because there's this little circle moment where you obviously experienced it, and then suddenly as life happens, it's this circle of where you're coming back to it. I would assume probably, you can tell me if I'm wrong, in a whole different way of looking at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I don't think I'd phrased it like that before, but that's definitely the case. So I grew up in a very sci-fi fantasy heavy household. My dad is obsessed with Lord of the Rings. And I remember when I was little, 2 or 3 years old, we had a pair of cockatiels, and they were named Gandalf and Galadriel. And he would also tell us stories growing up, bedtime stories that I thought he was making up, and they were often fantastical riffs off of classic rock songs. For instance, we got the tale of Jeremiah, who was a bullfrog and was this best friend of my dad that he met down by the river. all of the time, and how, Jeremiah would say this or that, and then he would just steal all the wine and be drinking wine all the time. This is a Three Dog Night song, everyone, which I did not discover until I was much older. And I was like, wait a second, Dad, that's your best friend, the bullfrog. Except no, it's Joy to the World. So I would get these stories about bullfrogs and trolls and all sorts of things. And then he read The Hobbit to us when we were little. And then at some point on family vacations, we would drive everywhere. There were 3 kids. I wasn't on an airplane until I was in college. So we were always on these family road trips, and because we moved away and went back to see my grandparents. And he would just hand me books before them so I wouldn't be annoying. And like one road trip, he was just like, here, Jenna, you're a 5th grader now. Here's the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy for you to read on this road trip. And I did. I read the whole entire Lord of the Rings trilogy on that road trip. And then was like, where can I get more of this? Where's the wizards? Where's the fantasy? Where's the dragons? And so just kept reading sci-fi and fantasy, but it was definitely incredibly white sci-fi and fantasy growing up that I was reading. Oh gosh, I also forgot generally Star Trek was just always on in the house. So you can always count on there being Star Trek in the background. To the point where I definitely wrote, I think my first piece of writing, speculative writing that I know about, my father found a couple years ago and handed an envelope to me of a printout he'd made of a story that I apparently wrote in middle school that is just real terrible knockoff Star Trek. It's bad. But yeah, so then I think the way that I came back to it after Peace Corps was someone recommending Wizard of the Crow to me. Gugu wa Thiong'o's book, Wizard of the Crow, which I read and just loved. And then was like, I didn't realize that this is what speculative works can look like, and started tracking down more African speculative fiction and seeing what I could find. And then opening up like a whole new world outside of the stuff I could find in my very white, small town, local Michigan library growing up.
So you graduated, you got a physics degree, you went to the Peace Corps, and you were in Tanzania. There's a shift there that's obviously happened while you were there. And then it's making you seek out, I would say it opened your mind, would you say, like to having like just new worlds that you just didn't experience?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was just very much like, oh, the things that I had assumed like are the way that people act or the way that people engage with the world, how they frame their lives in the world, like that's not the same everywhere. And it was very much a moment for me where I had to face like, I have been acting as if it were. I have like definitely been I don't know how to rude. I'm not coming up with good English words for it, but I've been acting in a way as if the things that I expect as norms are norms and they're not. And so then I need to rethink, like I need to learn how to understand how to engage in the world better. Basically.
I love that. Shingai, you had a question?
Yeah, this is just in line with everything that you've been saying, Jenna. I'm curious about whether your time in Tanzania, which I feel like you're saying it did, changed your perspective of your own whiteness, and like in what ways it did. I think that would be cool to just talk about and think through.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's got a lot of layers. because I don't think I had words for my whiteness yet at that time. And I think, I mean, there's different layers to it because it's more than, I mean, the thing that people will start with is then the like obviousness of skin color, but that's not the most important layer, because when in the village where I lived in, I was the only white person there. And it wasn't about the sorts of things we'd imagine in the US typically as racial divisions look like, where people segregate, where there's entrenched racial histories of oppression and domination built on skin color. We were in a Tanzanian, like I was in a Tanzanian village where I was just like the only white person there. It's a different legacy than that. It's the internalized assumptions and expectations of whiteness together with neocolonialism in that context that was more about the way I interacted with people and didn't understand and expected to be accommodated in ways that were that's what I had to come to terms with, expecting things of people, expecting to be accommodated in certain ways, the arrogance of it, the paternalism of it, more. And so whiteness as that structure of global
and I think that's what I meant. That's what I'm thinking about, like whiteness as a construct, whiteness as a structure that is inherently oppressive, and not like white as skin color.
Yeah. I know that you are, but I thought I would go into detail in case for people listening.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, but at the same time, then there were things that I saw there. I think for me, the way that whiteness then got continually like defined for me in how horrible it could be was in a lot of the interactions I would then have with other white Peace Corps volunteers, in hearing the way that they would tell stories, the sorts of things that I remember someone saying that he was annoyed once that he didn't get sat at the head table at a wedding because he had the assumption that as the like white guest. Nobody who is listening can see the expressions on people's faces right now, but like, just let me tell you, there are expressions on these faces right now. And I wish I were kidding, but so this was 2007 through 2009. And he was just like, well, they invite us to be like special. So they usually put us at the head table. And I was just like, okay, no, the fuck is that? But that attitude, I would see, it was interesting to me to see the way that white Peace Corps volunteers would either come to a place where they had deep questions about their own whiteness and what it was doing and what it meant, or it would just re-entrench it deeper and further, depending on how they were reading their own interactions in those contexts. I also am thinking structurally about the way the aid sector is set up, not for me, myself, but then seeing there was a Scottish family I knew who worked for DFID, which I think is the Department for Foreign and International Development, maybe. I can be getting that completely wrong, but it was the UK's version of USAID. And they had a young daughter. And then when she started going to school, after that year, they were like, we can't stay here any longer, because the way that the school system was set up and that the aid sector was set up, they were just watching her entrench like racist ideologies of who the like people she meets at school are versus who the wait staff at the aid organization parties are versus and just seeing the way that Tanzanians were often in that aid organ, like in the international aid spaces, relegated, while the white people from other countries were put in positions of power, like they could hear the way that their daughter was like engaging and interacting with other children shifting. And we're like, we have to get out of here before this sort of space in the aid world specifically would entrench that further in her. So I think that the structures of whiteness, particularly in context of aid and development work, run extremely deeply. Yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question anymore. I kind of just...
You are. I do have a follow-up question very quickly. Like, because the context of your work is going into the decolonial possibilities of the breaking apart of that system. So I'm curious about that.
Yes. Okay. So the book is kind of set into two halves. And the first half of it is basically I make the argument that there are two different Western structures that need to fall apart in order for decolonial possibility to emerge and grow in that falling apart. And one of them is Western subjectivities, particularly white Western subjectivities. But I think that neocolonialism in relation to Tanzanians can also like come out in those structures of Western ideas of identity as well, but very heavily in the white Western. But thinking about these as structures, right? So that structure of subjectivity that is based on a colonial and like that structure of whiteness understanding of who we are in relation to other people, who the US is in relation to other countries, who white people are in relation to other people, that those structures are internalized to the point where they structure how people think of themselves in the world, and that has to be deconstructed. Your understanding of self as a white Westerner has to be deconstructed and fall apart in order for you to build that back in a way where you can have decolonial relations, where you can have reciprocal relations with people. So that's the first half of the book, and that includes me. And then the second half of the book is looking at the ways that the Tanzanian workers at the NGO would engage in basically liquid means of resistance. So I pick up the work of some organizational communication scholars, Joel Cruz and Chigozie Sodeke, who write about liquid organizing. And then I'm kind of thinking about that as a means of disorganization in the book, and thinking about how are the Tanzanian aid workers making these liquid choices when they're faced with solid walls that the Westerners want to put up, sometimes literal. Because the thing about when I was at the organization that I was working with and first interviewing people, a lot of the Tanzanians were like, why do Westerners just want to build shit? Why do they always want to put up a building? They want to put up a building and they want to put their name on it, but they want to build the library. They don't want to hire the librarians. They want to build the clinic. They don't want to make sure that we have a steady stock of medicine and like gas to get patients from the village and bring them to the clinic. They want to build the thing and then be like, look, I did it. I made the thing happen. But they're like, you're not making it happen unless you're actually funding the things that we need and that we tell you we need. You just put up an empty building. And so I was thinking about the ways that like Western policies and procedures often operate in these solid ways. Buildings are these solid things. People think about things very solidly. But the Tanzanians would then use like water through cracks, find little ways to work through and around the stuff that was put up in their way. And so I write about how water, if it keeps going through cracks, pushing at these solid structures, will eventually tear them down. And so I'm looking at liquid agency as both a means of resistance and tearing down structures, but also organizing in the wake of that as well to create something new that is dependent on relationships. Because the thing about moving in these liquid ways rather than setting up the solid thing you can just plunk somewhere. You don't really need to think about the context that it's in. But if you're moving liquidly and emergently, you always have to be thinking about and responding to relations and contexts and people. And so that's what I was writing about. The way that the Tanzanian aid workers were organizing is both connecting in those relationships in ways that move around the Western attempts at solidifying, and then also can build new things beyond that.
Cool. So liquid organizing is a means of resistance to neocolonial structures.
That's something that I'm actually really excited to write about after our conversation, which I think will come out before this episode, on Sophia Samatar's The Practice, the Horizon, and the Chain. I was thinking about that as a kind of liquid movement too. And I've been thinking about it in relation to, because Sameem prompted me to think about it in relation to Suyi Davies Okumboa's Lost Ark Dreaming, and how they both end on the edge of revolution in these beautiful ways. But I think both of them are also moving in this liquid way to combat neocolonial structures as well. So that's going to be a chapter of my new book. Oh, I'm working on a new book.
Tell us about that new book. How is it forming?
It's forming like this. You're basically hearing the formation in the way that I form things. So the new book is under contract with Ohio State University Press in their New Sons series.
Can we pause really quickly? LP's here, y'all. Can we just have a round of applause for a book under contract?
Thank you. A book under contract.
Woo.
Now I just have to write it. But I have ideas. I have a lot, actually. But so this book is going to be called Decolonial Dreamwork, African Futurism and Imagination Beyond Development. And I'm looking at African speculative fiction and the ways that it challenges and actually just thinks outside of, basically, Western developmental logics. So not just development projects, but like one chapter of the book, which is in part on Shingai's work, there's a short version already published at Strange Horizons called African Futurism Beyond the Future. But that chapter is looking at how use of African temporalities that are thinking about time non-linearly and in not even in the same sorts of conceptual dimensions that the West does, and this logical progression and causal narrative of past, present, future, but in a deeper and different sort of relationality between present and then deep time that is what Westerners would call past and future, but is also more and beyond that. So I'm looking at how development narratives and logics, these neo-colonial logics, are based in this idea of forecasting and future predicting development that is only possible when you have this linear causal understanding of time. Outside of that, lots of other ways of engaging with the world and thinking about how to build better futurities, better worlds together can emerge that are fundamentally outside of the causal development narrative that locks people into relations to past and future that are used in colonialism. Like the idea that Africa is backward in time, right? That's only possible in this sort of Western development causal logic of what time looks like.
So I have a question, I guess, about how do you feel like you have to check yourself when you're doing this decolonial work, being like the white woman coming from the States? And do you still find yourself having this residual thoughts of Westernism when you're doing this work?
oh, got all the fucking time. Like that shit doesn't go away. Like it's not something that you're just like, oh yes, I have succeeded. I am no longer thinking in whiteness. I am no longer thinking colonialism. That's not how it works. So yes, it is something that I am constantly thinking about, and really actually a lot of what I was working on in my book, that the first book that was took me the longest time, and I spent the most time going over and over again, is kind of an idea of, in academic circles they'd call it reflexivity, but thinking about how do you come to an understanding of the ways you're doing harm in terms of power and relationships, the ways that you are reinforcing aspect, like different systems of domination in thought and behavior, and then how do you come to knowledge of that? Because I found that a lot of academics would just be like, yeah, just be reflexive. How? What does that mean? You just like are suddenly supposed to be aware, like, oh, yes, of course. Now, if I just think hard enough, magically, I'll understand this power system. And so what I wrote about in my book is actually that it's a process of haunting, of turning to talk to and face ghosts, literal deaths, literal people killed, harmed, and that it's only by facing the ghosts and violences and things that colonialism and whiteness attempts to obfuscate all of the time in order to continue, that white Westerners are able to write new narratives of self, but it's not ending, and it's not something you can just do by yourself. It has to be based in relationships and relationalities and deep understandings of the ways that you are relating to and interconnected with others. So yeah, continually something that I'm trying to pay attention to, but I think that like by building deeper relationships with people around me, the communities that I want to be most invested in and respondent to, listening, taking criticism as a gift is really important as well. That is the only way that you learn and get better. And for people to take criticism as if it is a stab at who they are as a person rather than a chance to do better is the killer mistake. The one that whiteness keeps doing over and over and over again. So I'm realizing that we have talked for almost an hour, and I don't think I've talked about my speculative work like almost at all. Is that
that's
okay?
Coming up next. Yeah, of course. Because it's all, to me, it's like all interconnecting, right? Like this is your origin story. This is everything that's building up to and that was actually my next question, is how has all these experiences, the research that you've done, your nonfiction work, how are you funneling it into your fiction, your speculative fiction? When you think of what type of writer you want to be, what do you want to write about, and how are you using story to maybe transform your own thoughts and people's thoughts about decolonizing?
Yeah. I don't know. I'm practicing. I'm practicing doing that and trying to figure out how to, I guess, write the stories that are engaging in that politic from a deep point of like emotional resonance and feeling. And what I initially started to do was just like hammer over the head sort of decolonial stories, and that's not it. It's not the right way of the academic way of like, here is the argument, is not how to make stories resonate. So I think I've had to experiment, and I don't think I've gotten to a place where I actually feel like I've done it as well as I want to yet. What I think politically I've gotten to come out well in my stories so far is reflections over what toxic masculinity does and those kinds of intimacies. I'm still working on, well, of course, I guess this makes sense. I can write about the intimacies because I'm writing like 1,000 word things. These are like scenes. And then I'm trying to write decolonial flash pieces. And y'all, it's maybe a little hard. Maybe I should be expanding the size of something if I'm trying to tackle those kinds of politics. Because I've tried to do it in 1,000 words, in 1,500 words, and you can tell me how well those turned out. There's a couple that are published. One of them is about this one is actually two Tanzanian characters who are in a relationship who have different approaches to revolution, and just playing with the way that two different people can approach revolution very differently and be engaging in that kind of activism very differently. That one's in Little Blue Marble. It's called Sing the Phoenix to Flame. And then there's one that I wrote for Orion's Belt that I think I would write differently now. I would write differently now. There's ways that I phrase things that I wouldn't use. But actually, this is something that I plan on talking about in the book as well that I'm writing now, because I think part of the problem is that people are reading part of the problem is that people aren't reading African work, and they should be. You should all be reading African science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction and surrealism. You should all be reading it. But then also, a part of the problem is that white Westerners are reading it with their frameworks and not stretching imagination to think about how new worlds could be imagined or how worlds can be engaged with outside of Western norms. And so I think that, the Orion's Belt story that I wrote, I would write differently now. And I don't think that I did a great job at writing a decolonial story, but I'm also really fucking glad I tried. We can talk about the publishing aspect of that later. And I have some other ones that didn't get published, and I'm glad that they're not published. And I'm also really glad that I wrote them, because I think you have to do that practice in writing things that are stretching your imagination, particularly for people coming from privileged classes or people who are like part of the domination force. If you're not practicing imagining differently, you're not going to be able to engage with the work that is. And you're going to be reading that and then reinforcing domination through the way it's responded to. So I think part of what I'm trying to write in the second book too is take some of the stories that I've attempted to write and be like, here's what I did well, here's what I failed at, but here's how to practice. You all should also be practicing, whoever is reading this book, practicing stretching your imagination, because I think that all of us doing that is important to really figuring out how to come together in solidarity.
LP, you had a question?
I was just thinking about how Jenna was talking about Flash is too small to write decolonial, and I was like, sometimes it's like, it feels like you have to take the Star Trek approach, where it's like, we're not going to tell you how we conquered racism and capitalism, but we're just going to show you the other side of it and let that be as novel as it wants to be and feel as foreign as it wants to be. But then after that, you can ask the questions like, why don't we know how this happened? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And
yeah,
also,
totally.
You are totally reminding me that we should shout out to Toby Ogundiran here. And hang on, I never say the word right. Ignominy. What's the name of that story?
I just gave you the word. I can't do everything.
Yeah, but here sits his ignominy. If you haven't read it, take 5 to 10 minutes and read his 750 some word deconstruction of colonialism, which is rad. So, okay, Toby did it. Everybody should be practicing how to take down colonialism in 1,000 words or less. If Toby did it, you can too.
I think there's something really interesting that you said about when everyone should be reading African work. And I found that like I know like me and Gabe read, and like in our writing group we read Sui's first book, David Mogo, God Hunter, and I'm not calling anyone out here, Gabe, but remember when we were talking about like the pacing and how it was moving?
Yeah,
And
the structure
yeah,
of it.
and you know,
Mhm.
a lot of you were like, well, I feel like, you know, there was a lot of telling. And I said, well, that's only because you're looking at it through a Western lens, right? Like you have to look at like where he's actually pulling those stories from to create his own. And I said, so we have to kind of rethink about how story structure should go, you know, and that's just a process of really reading widely. You know, because I gave them some examples of like things of like, because me and Sui talked about this like way when I met him at Futurescape, when his book was just about to come out, right? Because he was nervous. You know, he talked about it that, you know, it's kind of like a Jim Butcher book, but, you know, it's really taking from my, you know, Nigerian roots and, you know, it's forming those two together. And I think we do as white and Western, we need to rethink even about the way that we tell stories is not the universal way to tell stories. Like there's so many different ways and we have to be open to it and we have to keep reading widely so we can see different story structures.
Yeah, I mean, using that example, I think it came down to the expectations that we were coming into the story reading with our expectations of what the business asks for, which is predominantly white. So, and in Suyi's book in particular, it was like 3 stories in one, and we were not expecting that. And now looking back, that was like, that's amazing. It's 3 in 1, but they were also connected, and in just the one book. So yeah, that was very illuminating.
Yeah, I just thought that was a really great thing to say, Jenna. So go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say too on Suyi and the showing, not telling rule that gets thrown about, which like, are we done with that already? But he has a great chapter in Ex Marginalia, which is a collection edited by Chinelo Nwalu called The Exposition Tax, where he talks about as well the ways that particularly non-Western writers are expected to give more background of the context that they're writing about because they're expected to be writing about or writing for audience that don't know that context. And so often have to, in order to sell perhaps to like the big genre magazines, have more exposition about explaining the context to the presumed normative white reader, which is also its own bullshit. But yeah, he's got a great chapter on that too, and the ways that that is used against marginalized writers as either you are not giving enough context for whoever the presumed us is to understand where you're writing from, or you're just telling instead of showing. So the exposition tax like works against them either way in those circumstances.
So my next question, Jenna, is have you been afraid to write a novel? Have you, because you just talked about like, oh, maybe I need to stop getting away from Flash and I need to write something longer. Is it something that you have been tinkering with? Has it been like a little fear of trepidation, or talk to me about that?
Ouch, Will. How do you know me so well already? That's unfair. Yes, of course I'm afraid to write a novel, but it's mostly because everybody talks about how the first thing that you write is just trash. And then you trash that, and then you write something else. And then you take that something else and you're like, oh, we need to Matt Bell this shit and write it 3 more times. And I'm just like, I don't have time for that, but I do have time. I mean, I should have time for that, I guess. I do really want to write a novel. It's just the scary thing is that everybody keeps talking about how the first one doesn't work. And so then it's hard to work up the motivation to start it when you keep being told it's not going to work anyway. I I appreciate LP putting in the chat that that's not true. I kind of just need someone to lie to me. Honestly, I need someone to lie to me. I need someone to tell me.
Jenna,
that my
your first novel is going to be a bestseller. There, I've done it. Are you going to write it now?
Thank you, Shingai. Yes, I will.
And that's not even a lie.
Maybe now I will try. But yeah, I think part of what I've been telling myself too is that once I get through this academic book, that I do actually have a deadline to submit to some people, and would like to have it in the world, because I think it would be a good thing to have in the world. That then next step, maybe novel.
And with this novel, I'm just gonna maybe just go off on feelings right here. Is the novel that you're thinking of writing also grappling with things of grief? And does having to go into that long process of talking about grief, is that's what's actually kind of scary for you?
Ooh, I think, yeah, it's not, I think, the process of grappling with grief that is the scary part, but the process of grappling with the guilt that can come along with grief is the scary part.
I get that 100%.
Yeah, because the idea that I have for a novel is very much a kind of, I'm calling it like cli-fi high fantasy that would deal with the ramifications of, one area's decision to do weather controlling magic on the communities surrounding them. And there's actual literal ghosts that would get connected to characters that they would have to come to terms with responsibility. Like the whole magic system is based on being paired with a ghost that you have responsibility for their death in order to work magic. So you would have to come to terms with or engage with that responsibility for death in order to work magic. And I'm thinking about that on a like societal structural level as well as individual. And I'm afraid I'm not going to do it very well, really.
I think you'll do it great, and we'll have that first draft by January.
January of 2024. So you're already late.
Yeah. Sameem, go ahead.
No.
I have a question, but this could also be a whole other podcast episode. So if that's the case, feel free to say so. But I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about how you're able to bring, or if you're able to bring your speculative fiction work into your academic spaces and how that's received. Or if you found that challenging.
Yeah. I have just done it and like asked for not even asked for forgiveness instead of permission, just done it and been like, this is academic too. Challenge me. I have reasons. And yeah, so I have my stories on my academic CV. I put them in my narrative for tenure, which I don't know when this episode is coming out, but at the time of recording, I should know in approximately 1 month if I have tenure, if that is still a thing in 1 month. We'll see. But yeah, I have just, for me, they're deeply interrelated. The reason that I am writing about speculative fiction in my academic work, the reason I'm writing speculative fiction, it's all related to the praxis that I think my work is engaging in generally, which is trying to help us find groundwork together for collectively imagining different ways of being in the world and putting them into action. And so the academic work and the speculative fiction work to me are doing the same thing. And so I have actually found a lot of resonance with the kind of people I want to have resonance with in doing that. And then the other people are just like, well, if she's claiming it this hard, we're not going to fight with her, is how it seems to be going. But like the graduate students that I work with at ASU, are super excited to engage with speculative fiction, are really passionate about it. I've managed to teach now twice a little short course. They let us do these little short courses on things, and I taught one twice on writing speculative fiction for social justice. I've been asked to do that lecture actually in the community here at a community bookstore. A couple universities, different professors at other universities will contact me and ask me to come in and talk to their communication graduate students about ways that they can incorporate speculative fiction. I got asked to come in to talk for a class at the University of North Texas on my book, and the class is on world building. So they both read my book and then also one of the speculative fiction stories I wrote and talked about the two of them together and asked me to come in to talk about that. So I think it was not something that the communication studies discipline, which is my academic discipline, was doing 5 years ago, but it is something that they're doing now. Actually, the very first story I got got accepted. I think it was published later, but the first story I got accepted was in an academic journal. The call was for people to use speculative fiction, use their research to write speculative fiction that imagined liberatory worlds. And so the first story that I ever wrote was one for that call that took my research on aid work in Tanzania and used it to imagine liberatory worlds. Unfortunately, since it was published in an academic journal, it will never see the light of anywhere else because they are not like spec fic places, and they hold your copyright. So I would have to pay to reprint that instead of get paid to reprint that. But I don't tell Taylor and Francis there's a copy on my website.
I love it. Okay, so as we wind down, we're going to come down to our final question. So, Jenna, I just want to know, what keeps you writing?
The community keeps me writing. And the feelings. The feelings have to come out somewhere, and they're going to come out in the writing. So, community, feelings, that's what keeps me writing.
And this has been Just Keep Writing, a podcast for writers, by writers, to keep you writing. You can find us at justkeepwriting.org. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Feel free to reach out to any of us on our social medias, and please jump in our Just Keep Writing Discord channel. Links to all of that is in the show notes. Lastly, please support our show by going to patreon.com/justkeepwriting. We offer daily writing prompts, early access to podcast episodes, and much more. Thanks for listening, and just keep writing.